This week, we are continuing our conversation series titled This Land, where we are exploring what the land teaches us from within the biblical text. It is interesting what surfaces in the Bible when you change the lens you are reading it with. Most of us are oblivious to the things that influence how we read the story in the Bible and truthfully how we see the world around us. But if we are intentional, we can see things from a different perspective. And that is what I mean by changing the lens you are reading with. When reading the Bible this week, I intentionally tried to read the text centering the land and creation first in order to see if I could see things that I may have previously missed. This led me to stop at Revelation 11:18. The nations raged, and now God's wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead, rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. The words, destroying those who destroy the earth, are the words that made me stop on this verse. What a fun verse, right? Too many of my theological trigger words are there. Rage, wrath, judgment, destroy. Sounds like a party, right? Sounds like good times. How we have been taught to read the Bible and the version of God that we have been taught will drastically affect the way we read the word wrath in the Bible and in this particular verse. If the version of God you were taught and hold on to still is an angry and distant character that you want to avoid because you don't want to get on his bad side, and thus you were taught to be afraid of him, it's sort of like dealing with an abusive parent, right? Or if the version of God that you have come to know is loving and just and working to restoring the good and beautiful in this world, then that's also going to change the way that you read this. Whichever image is dominant in your mind, in your imagination, will determine how you heard Revelation 18 when I read it. For all of the reimagining of faith that I've gone through in my life, certain words trigger me still, and I find myself fighting against the image of an abusive God. The words wrath, judgment, and destroy are all triggers for me, as I said. And my initial response is either to fight or flee from those words. But experience has taught me that I need to slow down and process instead of fighting or fleeing. So as I began to settle into this verse, to read and reread it, a few things started to stand out for me. One is the definition of the word wrath. It is a word loaded with so much theological baggage that it has become unhelpful in understanding what the word is communicating to us. The Greek word translated as wrath in this passage is the same word translated as rage. The nations raged with injustice, and God's wrath showed up for justice. It is a juxtaposition the author of this verse is intentionally making. And the Greek word translated as rage and wrath changes nuance and definition depending on how the concept it connects to plays with the word. So when the word wrath is connected to the concept of justice, it carries a definition like this: a strong indignation directed at wrongdoing. When I was thinking about what that difference means, I remembered a scene from the show The Walking Dead. In this scene, Rick Grimes' son, Carl, is being threatened by an evil and vile man who has raged against Rick and Carl. And this man and his compatriots are trying to do something horrific. They are trying to destroy Carl, but Rick's wrath was unleashed in protecting Carl from these men, and Rick ended up destroying them all in order to save Carl. Now, I don't think this scene is a one-to-one comparison, obviously, but I can see the definition of a strong indignation directed at wrongdoing at play, which helps me to see it at play in this verse. The men, like the nations, raged with evil intent, but Rick, like God, rages to protect the vulnerable and those being harmed by those with evil intent. Those who destroyed are destroyed. Even though this helps me to better grasp the verse, it doesn't help me to move past it. It still feels problematic for me, in all honesty. But instead of just seeing the violence of this passage, it helped me to see that the author was making a contrast and that God shows up with a purpose and is bringing the story forward towards liberation and restoration. N.T. Wright, when he talks about reconciliation of all things or eschatology, the big question of where are things going, uses the phrase, God is putting things to rights. This means that all the injustices and the evil in the world are being judged, but so are the good and beautiful. And that judgment is not about punishment, but about making good on God's declaration about creation. They saw everything they had created, and indeed it was very good. Putting things to rights is God moving from being sorry they ever created anything in the first place to restoring the beauty and harmony and peace that was lost. We call that loss of the good and beautiful death. And how does God deal with death in creation? By becoming part of creation and submitting to death. God's wrath is poured out and satisfied, not by becoming John Wick or Rick Grimes on those who hurt their beloved creation, but by submitting to the loss in order to create a way to move forward from death to new life. It is in this new life that all of creation flourishes once again. In the middle of one of the, if not the most misunderstood books of the Bible, you have all this imagery of destruction. And it's scary. The imagery is scary. But when we read about this destruction, we fail to see that it describes the violence and destruction already present in the world around us. The author of Revelation just frames it as a cosmic struggle between the forces of evil, the systems of oppression and destruction, and the forces of creation, the community of the good and beautiful. Although I don't engage in it as much as I once did, I'm an MC, I'm a rapper, and hip hop is like my native tongue. Sometimes when I'm trying to wrap my mind around a concept or break something down, the easiest way for me to think about it is to write some bars or to rap it out. It helps me to draw in other concepts and thoughts as I process. And so these are some bars that I wrote as I was trying to process this verse. Desperate for prophylactics against evil tactics, the nations rage and the children are mad sick. But God's wrath has come, struck like a matchstick, destroying those who destroy the earth. It's over, that's it. The earth is oppressed under the weight of men's greed and plastic. And God is the God of the oppressed and they're active. Remember, the land is desperately longing for liberation, for the children of God to come and pour out some libations. So in these situations where we're facing total annihilation, what exactly should God's response be to the destruction of their creation? Remember, God hears the cries of the oppressed and reacts. So if the land is crying, God is responding. Keep it a buck, big facts. Remember, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but the destructive forces of the systems below and above. But it is always the flesh of the innocent that gets mangled and hurt, and God's wrath has come against those who are destroying the earth. One of the things that my reflection has shown me is that I'm uncomfortable with the language that challenges my privilege. Could it be that we do not like language, the language of God's wrath showing up because we know that if God is the God of the oppressed, then God is against us as collaborators in this system of oppression in the world? And because we have been taught to read the Bible from this individualized moral guide, we absolve ourselves from culpability in the oppressive systems of this world. I prayed a prayer. I'm good, we tell ourselves. But we continue to destroy the earth and ourselves in the process. All this makes us extremely uncomfortable with the language of wrath. So we have gone from using the language of wrath against those we demonized and othered, to rejecting the language of God's wrath altogether, because God is love and thus loves humans first. Ultimately saying that God's love and justice cannot coexist. But to quote Dr. Cornel West, Jesus is what God looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. But neither of the above stances, God's wrath against those we demonize or the rejection of it altogether, demands that we change our oppressive and destructive behaviors. It is just two ways of pushing away our culpability in destroying God's good and beautiful, and our responsibility to change and stand in judgment. I think that our collective belief that judgment is negative betrays the fact that we know we are guilty of participating in the oppression of each other and the oppression of creation as a whole. And thus we inherently believe judgment to be negative and thus against us. But in this passage, God's wrath brings judgment, and that judgment rewards those who stood against the oppressive and destructive forces, but it destroys those who destroy the earth. God's judgment is kind and generous and liberating for those under the weight of oppression, but it is terrible and devastating for those who participate in the destruction of God's good and beautiful creation. We are beckoned to remember Jesus' words in Matthew 7. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. If we bring forth life, we get life. If we bring forth death, we get death. We need the land, but if we destroy the land, we are destroying ourselves in the process. In this way, creation care becomes a central tenet of salvation and eschatology. And the question, what did you do to the land, becomes one of the most essential questions in God's judgment in this world. Here's another way to think about it. We have all been taught that God is going to judge you for watching porn, but I don't think that's what God is judging. God is judging the ways that you are participating in the oppression and destruction of this world. And consensual sex is not destroying or oppressing anything, but sexual slavery is. And the reality is that some of the porn people consume is produced by the means of sexual enslavement. God is not angry at your horniness, but the harm that befalls God's beloved creation when your desires harm others. Now let's take that thought and expand it beyond humans. The land is talked about as being enslaved, and we know that slavery is oppressive and destructive, but we passively participate in that enslavement through our own personal practices similar to watching porn. And we say to ourselves, I'm doing nothing wrong. I'm not enslaving anyone. But we fail to acknowledge or understand the connection between our deeds and the oppressive and destructive systems that enslave others, including the land. As much as we don't want to admit it, we inherently know. This is why we desperately create ideological frameworks that absolve us from the culpability and responsibility. From the first humans blaming the serpent and each other to our current crisis of climate change, we extract our guilt and lay it at the feet of others. So what does the land teach us? I think the land teaches us that God is always on the side of the oppressed. I think the land teaches us about reciprocity, that we receive what we give. And I think the land teaches us that we cannot claim passivity. We are either caring for the land or destroying it. There is no other side.